Genesis, in particular the first chapters, 1 through 3, are possibly the most important chapters in all literature. I mean, if you were going to list the top 5 texts, essays, novels, books, etc., if you were going to list the most important, most influential texts out there, Genesis would be one of them. It has been influencing the way we think about nature, the way we think about sin, the way we think about humans and humans interacting with other humans for thousands of years. So one cannot over exaggerate the importance of this passage. You may not be a Christian, you may not be Jewish, and this, by the way, is not a Christian book. This is, in fact, a Jewish book. It wasn't written by Christians. And regardless, you may be an atheist, and these 3 chapters are so influential, they will have influenced you at some moment. What I'm about to do is to give you a brief interpretation of Genesis. This is my own interpretation. I grew up in a fairly conservative Christian context, so it's not a Jewish interpretation. It's probably a kind of Christian interpretation influenced by postmodern theory. So it's biased, right? So keep that in mind. There are lots of different ways to interpret this. This is my own particular interpretation. If you're in EN 220 during the summer of 2014, you need to watch this and listen to it very carefully, because your second mini theme is based on Genesis, requires you to know Genesis. So read this and listen to this video in detail. Let's begin here. This is essentially the order of this conversation that this conversation is going to go in. The first thing you need to be thinking about is this is really a simple text to talk about in terms of, let's say, problem solution. There is a problem. The problem is what Christians would call sin. Sin could be defined as a sense of separation or alienation from God, humans, or nature. Now, this should remind you, if you read recently in EN 220, Michael Pollan's essay. Sin is separation from God, humans, nature. Sometimes we have this feeling, I certainly have, this feeling of separation, distance, lack of community, right? What Genesis does is it gives us an answer to the problem of sin. It tells us how we got to sin, where we were before sin, and what it was that humans did that brought them to this sense of being alone and separate from God, humans, and nature. Okay? That's important, that definition of sin. Now, these are some really key distinctions as well. We've already started chatting about these things. There are 2 ways, you could say, to exist in the world. You can exist in the world in community or interrelationship with all humans and nature, which assumes that you don't exist alone, right? You don't exist alone, but you always exist with the world. There is no individual on this side, right? Community, interrelationship implies that no one exists alone. Now, in our culture, of course, in Western culture, we talk a lot about individualism, and this is hard to explain, but truthfully, these notions of how people exist in the world are socially constructed. Look up a guy named René Descartes. René Descartes is the fellow who is said to have essentially invented Western individualism, right? Go to Stanford. This would be tough reading, but if you really wanted to know about the origin of individualism, read René Descartes. Now, linked with René Descartes, who lived in the 17th century, of course, is the rise of capitalism, which is very much built upon individualism, but that's a whole nother discussion, and we'll get to that later. So, in the West, in the last 300-400 years, we've invented this thing called the individual, right? In other cultures, they have other ideas about how we exist in the world. For instance, some of you know this word, Ubuntu, and I'm probably mispronouncing it. I spelled it wrong too. It's not only an operating system, but it is in fact, let's see if I can find this quickly. It is in fact a word out of African philosophy. Let me show you this. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Wikipedia, not a great source, but it'll give us, it'll very quickly, maybe, I'm doing this on the fly, bad idea in a video cast. It says roughly translated to human roughness, humanness, often translated as humanity towards others. Here we go. Ubuntu is often translated the belief in a universal bond of sharing that connects all humanity. And there's probably better, but in essence, my understanding of Ubuntu is that every human has his or her being in relationship with others. I cannot be, this is my classic example in the classroom, I cannot be a professor without students. I mean, can a professor be a professor without students? Can students be students without professors? Not really. We have a symbiotic relationship. I cannot be who I am without you, right? And that's kind of what Ubuntu, if I wanted to put this word here, speaks to. That we are not individuals. We need one another. We need one another to exist in the world, right? So this is a major distinction. Community, interrelationship. If you believe that you're interrelated with the world, your politics and your ethics and your morality is going to be vastly different than someone who believes that he or she doesn't need or depend on the world. Because to be an individual means, in fact, strictly speaking, philosophically speaking, I wrote about this in my dissertation. I know a little bit about this. To be an individual means that you need nothing. You need no one. In fact, the notion of individualism is ultimately tied up with divinity. The only strictly individual person, entity in the universe is God. All right? God who doesn't need humans, who doesn't need nature. God who exists on his or her or its own, depending on your definition of God. So individualism is a really radical notion, which, at least in my perspective, quite bluntly, is impossible. I say to students who tell me they're individuals, I say, all right, so the thing that says your individuality most importantly, most crucially, of course, is your name. You are Tyler Smith, and that name denotes your individuality, yes? And then I say, did you choose your name? And of course they didn't. I mean, the thing that says who you are most precisely, your name, theoretically, right, was given to you before you were even born. Hardly anyone changes their names. I've changed my name, actually, back in 1995. Didn't like my last name. But even our language, even our religion, to a large extent, these things are not things we choose. You know, our parents, our society puts in front of us certain choices, limits our choices, and we often unconsciously choose those things. We think we're choosing those things freely, but in fact, to the degree society limits our choices, how free are our decisions? Okay, very important question, and I could talk about this a whole lot. I'm going to talk about dualism. The word dual, of course, makes you think of two, right? Two as in a duo, right? A duo, two, right? Dualism is a fancy word for thinking about or a tendency to see reality in terms of oppositions. Men versus women, totally different. Blacks versus whites, totally different. Humans versus nature, totally different. Capitalists versus communists, totally different. The classic origin of dualism is mind-body dualism, right? Believing that the mind, the mind is separate from the body. This goes back all the way back to the Greeks, Plato. It's all over the New Testament Bible, of course, as well. If you think about the virgin birth of Jesus Christ, the virgin birth implies that there was no flesh. In the Bible, they would talk about the flesh, in particular in the King James Version. There's no flesh involved in the construction in the birth of Jesus. There's a kind of nervousness in the New Testament, and I'm not the first person to point this out, about bodies. So Jesus was not born of a man and a woman in bed together. Jesus was born of the Spirit of the spirit kind of entering into the body of Mary, right? So there's a kind of nervousness about mind and bodies, or spirit and flesh, in the Bible, certainly in Western culture in general. The origin of individualism, right? Let me put one more here. Self versus other. If you believe, or I should add this, right? The individual self, right? Versus the other. If you believe the individual self exists on its own, then it sees itself quite naturally as against the other or others, right? Um, okay, so these are really, really, really important distinctions. Now, sin is separation, right? Hopefully, you're seeing that that separation is connected with individualism, right? And a tendency to see the self as separate from the world. Now, what we're going to do, um, and this will be a two-part video, is I'm going to talk a little bit about Genesis and how Genesis, one of the most important foundational myths and stories of Western culture, begins to talk about these issues. I'm going to pause now. This will be part one. If you have any questions, remember to email me. In the next video, I will begin talking about Genesis.